Hey guys, what's up here? Mr. Castro. So we're going to take a look at the rise of imperialism, both domestically and foreign, and then eventually we'll take a look at World War I also. So we're just going to take a look at some of the domestic things that began to happen as we began to move west. So one of the things that we need to talk about is some of the treaties and some of the problems that began to rise up with the Native Americans. For example, one of the major treaties that happened prior to the Civil War is called the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851. In this treaty between the United States and some of the native tribes, it happened on September 17th between the United States Treaty Commissioners and representatives of the Cheyenne, the Sioux, the Arapacho, the Crow, the Assiniboine, the Mandan, the Hidatsa, and Arikara nations. And you can see what it did is Native Americans guaranteed safe passage for settlers on the Oregon Trail. In return, promises of an annuity of $50,000 for 50 years. And essentially what it did is it kind of created sort of a reservation area in the Dakotas. Then we had the Treaty of Fort Atkinson of 1853, secured the rights of whites to hunt some of the bison in the area, confined the Indians to more reservations in the area, guaranteed safe passage of whites through Indian land again, recognized the Indian nations as sovereign and independent under terms of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in the lands that were ceded, so areas like Nevada, Arizona, more like of the Apache, the Nez Perce, some of those natives. So the Dakota Territories were the organized incorporated territory of the U.S. that existed from March 2nd, 1861 to November 2nd, 1889. Following the Civil War, hostilities continued with the Sioux until the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie. So again, this whole area was created. Population increase can largely be attributed to the growth of the Northern Pacific Railroad. As more and more people were moving into that area, we wanted to make sure that they were moved into another area. Gold was then discovered in the Black Hills in 1874 and attracted more and more settlers to the area, which is going to create more of the clashes with some of these native people. So the Indian Wars between 1864 and 1890, a series of skirmishes between the natives and again the white man. Post-Civil War U.S. Army mission was to get the natives out of the West. One of the things that they did is after the Civil War is they began using, for example, African American soldiers. And one of the things that they did is they used the African American soldiers as sort of like a buffer between them and the Indians. And one of the Indians, the natives, one of the things that they did is when they saw the black soldiers, they said that their skin and their hair resembled that of their buffalo. So they began referring to the African American soldiers as buffalo soldiers. That's where the term buffalo soldier comes from. And one of the things that we'll do in classes is we'll listen to the song, the Bob Marley song. So innovation of the Colt 45, the Winchester repeating rifle was huge in terms of getting the natives out of the area. Then one of the things that we'll see is a series of quote-unquote skirmishes or battles between the natives and the whites. Many people say massacres on both sides. One of the first major ones was the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864. It happened in Sand Creek, Colorado. Colonel J.M. Shivingston, 700-man force. He took a 700-man force to Colorado Territory. They attacked some of the Cheyenne and Arapacho villages, killed and mutilated an estimated 70 to 163 Indians, about two-thirds of which were women and children. After the event, many Cheyenne, including the great warrior Roman Nose, attacked settlers around the Platte Valley, including attacks on Fort Casper, Wyoming in 1865. So a lot of responses back. Then in 1866, there was the Fetterman Massacre. One of the things that happened in 1866, the tribe of Oglala Sioux under Chief Red Cloud, provoked by the building of the Bozeman Trail through their hunting ground in southern Montana. They massacred U.S. Army unit commanded by Captain W.J. Fetterman, which of course just responding back and forth to each other. So then in 1868, the real major treaty was signed, again, Fort Laramie. So it's the 1868 one. U.S. government agrees not to build a road through Sioux territory and abandon 3 forts. If the Sioux agree to live on a reservation supported by the U.S. government, we said that we would essentially leave them alone, very similar to what we did with some of the natives of Oklahoma. guaranteeing to the Lakota ownership of the Black Hills, the Dakota Territory. But then again, like I said, gold was discovered in that area. So June 25th through the 26th, 1876, near the Little Bighorn River in eastern Montana Territory, there was an overwhelming victory for the Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and the Arapaho, led by several major war leaders, including Crazy Horse and Chief Gall. One of the things again that provoked this was the discovery of gold in the Dakotas. So Colonel George A. Custer and all of his men were killed by Sioux Indians, and so talk about the 7th Cavalry in class a little bit. Then one of the other people that was dealing with all this stuff too was gold was discovered in Idaho area. Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce tried defending his people, was not able to. 1877 there was the Nez Perce War, and eventually Chief Joseph surrendered. There's a very famous speech that we'll take a look at in class. One of the people that was actually really difficult to control was the Apache leader, Geronimo. He had defended the Apache land in Arizona, and eventually was captured in Mexico by the United States Army. So one of the things that we see in terms of subduing the tribes, obviously the railroads are going to play a major role. Disease is going to play a major role as we begin to expand west. The extermination of the buffalo. Again, prior to the Civil War, all these numbers, and then after, right, smaller, the wars, right, between the white man and the native man, and again, just the loss of their land. So again, one of the things that we see in this picture, right, is you see these guys standing on all these skulls of buffalo. So antebellum buffalo population was over 15 million buffalo. By 1865, there were 15 million. And by 1885, there are fewer than 1,000. And again, the only American buffalo that actually exists, so the bison, can be found in Yellowstone National Park. Some of the Americans began to write about some of the stuff that was happening. And one of the things that we'll see, so we'll begin to see people begin to write about what was happening. One of these people was a woman by the name of Helen Hunt Jackson, and so she wrote a book called A Century of Dishonor. So it kind of began to focus on some of the sympathy for the natives, but it also brought up an attitude of whether whites wanted to help the natives assimilate, which really meant that they didn't respect their culture, or kill them. So there was really no we're going to live together with them. One of the things also that really disturbed a lot of the whites was some of the cultural things that the natives did. For example, one of the major things that freaked them out was the ghost dance. So many missionaries were urging the natives and urging the United States government to force the natives to convert to Christianity or to actually stop doing these dances. And so in 1884, the government actually outlawed the sun dance, or otherwise known as the ghost dance. And so because Americans mistook it as like this war drumming ritual, when in fact it was not. So one of the things that we'll see as a result of this is the Battle of Wounded Knee. There's a really good book out there called Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. HBO made a film about it too. But it took place on December 29th, 1890 near Wounded Knee Creek, South Dakota, because they were going after some of the war chiefs, and because they were still practicing the ghost dance. U.S. Army attacked the quote-unquote armed Lakota, killing 90 men, 200 women and children. So finally in 1887, one of the things that the government did is they passed what was called the Dawes Severity Act. It dissolved the legal entities of all tribes, basically saying that they no longer had tribal statehood, which meant that the United States government, any of the treaties that were signed, were essentially null and void. One of the things that it also did is it individualized the natives. And so each native tribe could essentially sell off its land. One of the things that the government wanted to be able to do was control the lands so that they can sell it for private development. And any of the money that was left over from the development, the government said that they were going to help the Native Americans assimilate. One of the things that they did is they started building schools. And one of the schools was, of course, the Carlisle School that was built in Pennsylvania. One of the things that they said about the natives under the Dawes Act was that they could achieve full citizenship after 25 years of showing good behavior. All of this was not outlawed by the federal government until the 1934 Indian Reorganization Act, which was called the Indian New Deal. So one of the things that also obviously affected what was happening, right, the push and pull factors in terms of what was happening was the mining bonanza. So for example, obviously we know about the 49ers, but then there was also the 1859 gold rush that struck Colorado with the 1859ers. And then that same year, there was the Comstock lode, where there was a huge gold and silver mining burst in Nevada. So $340 million worth of gold and silver was discovered. And so one of the things that we'll begin to see, because of the mining and because of the movement west, women start to become really, really important out west. And one of the things that we'll see in terms of women moving out west and their importance is that these women began to push for certain rights. And for example, in Wyoming in 1869, it was the first state to actually grant women suffrage. One of the things we also see is the beef bonanza. So railroad and ice trucks made it possible for cattle to be shipped. Developed. We see the birth of the beef barons in terms of trying to monopolize the beef industry with people like Swift and Armour, places like Chicago. We'll also see the long drive with the cowboys from Texas to places like Kansas, and you can see here in the map. And then, of course, the farmers, like I said, the farmers began pushing the frontier. So the Homestead Act of 1862, really important. Families had difficult, though, right, along the plains because of irrigation. There's also a lot of corruption with the speculators and the railroads. And there was a huge demand for wheat, which led to some of the wheat farming. But we'll also see a lot of overproduction. In 1890, the United States Census announced that the frontier was closed. In other words, that everything that the United States was going to touch in terms of from the east to the west was gone. And so this guy, Frederick Jackson Turner wrote this essay called On the Closing of the Frontier, saying that Americans needed another frontier to generate movement. And so we begin to talk about like imperialism and sort of the safety valve theory. One of the things that also becomes important, like I was saying, is because the farmers began to overproduce, which is kind of a paradox for the farmers, right? Because they want to produce, but when they produce too much, you get a surplus, which means the prices go down, which means they don't make as much money. And so they have this sort of paradox, right? Because they are not going to not produce, so they need to produce, but that by producing too much, like I said, it actually drives down their prices. And so in 1880, world farmers also began to compete and drive down American prices. Farmers began to have a hard time paying back some of their debts. So the farmers began demanding for inflation, right? So again, we were having this conversation about soft money versus hard money. So the farmers began saying that the answer to their problems would be to create inflation. So the farmers being exploited by different trusts and railroads, right, to on top of all that, they're going to feel like everybody's out to get them, that the government's not protecting them, the government's not helping them, and they're not protecting them against the railroads and other trusts. So we'll begin to see some farmer movements. So in 1867, the National Grange of the Patrons of Husbandry, right, otherwise known as the Grange, founded by Oliver Kelly, 800,000 members. We'll also see the Greenback Labor Party, right? Again, people who wanted to push for inflation. Eventually, they are going to have 14 members of Congress. And then the big one, 1870, is the Farmers Alliance. They pushed for the nationalization of the railroads, that the government should take over the railroads. The abolition of the national banks. They wanted to see a graduated income tax. The idea being that if you made more money, you paid more in terms of percentage. And then a federal sub-treasury for farmers. So somebody working within the government, within the Treasury Department, that specifically was there to assist the farmers. So as a result of a lot of what we're going to see, we're going to eventually see a mass movement emerge, known as the populist movement. So it was started by Ignatius Donnelly and Mary Elizabeth Lease. Attacked those that hurt farmers, banks, and the railroads. And so we'll see the development of the Farmer Alliance evolving into the People's Party, right? So all of these different small movements sort of came together into one large movement known as the People's Party or the Populist Party. The Panic of 1893 pissed a lot of people off because, again, they felt like this wouldn't have happened if the government was doing their job. One of these people was a guy by the name of Jacob Coxey, and so he took some of the unhappy sort of farmers and they pushed to Washington, D.C. They wanted to see relieved unemployment and an increase in cash, $500 million in terms of notes. So again, inflation. during this time, we're also going to see a huge strike called the Pullman Strike. It was organized by a man that you guys need to get yourselves acquainted with, a guy by the name of Eugene Debs. He becomes the leading socialist in the United States at the time. So he was the president of the Union of Sleeper Cars Importers. He was the person who sort of helped organize a lot of people that worked for like George Pullman and like the making of the sleeping car. And so in Panic of 1883 led to the wage cuts with George Pullman. So the U.S. government they used federal troops to put down the Pullman strike. And so for a lot of people, again, more evidence that the federal government was not on their side. Debs, again, turned into the leading socialist in the United States. So during this time, we're going to see an election in 1896. The Republican candidate for the election was actually paid for. And when I say paid for, I mean like votes were paid for. Contributions were made by some of the leading industrialists because they wanted to make sure that they got their man in power. In this case, their man was a guy by the name of William McKinley, who was very pro-business. And he wanted to maintain the gold standard and also very pro-imperialistic. He was going up against the Democratic candidate, guy by the name of William Jennings Bryan, who was essentially a populist. He gave this incredible cross of gold speech. And in this speech, he talked about the unlimited coinage of silver. And so one of the things with the populists, though, is they were kind of torn because they were like, is he a Democrat? Is he a populist? And one of the things that we'll see is this actually hurts because it's kind of like today, like the Democrats tend to be a lot more green in terms of what they are in favor of, in terms of the environment. But they are definitely not to the extreme of like the Green Party.